It was an evening with no power, a fireplace fire, oil lamps, a candle on the table. Nickel wrote in his notebook. The room was warm, but Flora sat with a blanket around her shoulders. She had a faraway look. "What are you thinking about?" I asked her. "My youth," she said. Nickel grinned. "Like now?" he asked. Flora shook her head. "I feel different." "You are different," I said. "You've been brave. You wrote a note and left it for your mother. You kept us in good food for nearly 5 days." I thought of Sylvan's students, romping through life like puppies, young people trying to write their way into adulthood. "Do you remember when I was born?" Flora asked Nickel. "I do. I wanted a guinea pig." "Do you remember when you were young?" Flora asked me. "I'm not sure my memories are like yours. I remember Sylvan most because he gave me words for my memories. Before that, I remember moments, but I had no words for them." Flora lifted her shoulders and sighed. "I think I feel different because I have worries. I never had worries before now." "What are you worried about?" asked Nickel. "Not what. Who," said Flora. "Who?" I asked. Flora stared at me. "You," she said. Nickel looked up from his writing, waiting to hear what I'd say. I worried about me too, but I didn't want to tell them that. "I have Ellie," I said. "Don't worry." Ellie visits us every day. Sometimes she brings food for dinner. For a while, Sylvan seems better. He writes every day. He reads to me every day. When Sylvan forgets to take his medicine, I shake the bottles in my mouth so he remembers. The poets arrive for a class, and the boy who tried to write Ox Cart Man in his own words reads a poem Sylvan loves. It's called The Crazy Cows of Spring. The cows are crazy with spring, breaking through the fence, galloping to town, leaving their cow pies behind. Flora and Nickel seemed comforted by the idea of Ellie taking care of me every day. "She can't get here because of the storm," I told them, "but she knows that I can get in the house and find my open bag of dog food in the bottom pantry bin." I paused. Sylvan taught me that. It was bedtime, and we laid down blankets and pillows on the red rug. "And when you're back home, Ellie will drive me to visit you in her little red car." "Let's have a party tomorrow to celebrate," said Flora. I found a can of frosting in the pantry. A party? We turned off the oil lamps and blew out the candle. We could hear ice pellets hitting the windows and roof. The three of us slept in a heap in front of the fire, all night, together. We woke in the morning at the same time, raising our heads, listening for a sound of wind. We heard nothing. We looked at one another. Silence. The storm had ended. Surprisingly, Flora burst into tears. Nickel sat up and put his arm around her. "It's all right, Flora," he said. "We knew the storm wouldn't last forever." "Can we still have a party?" Flora asked. I left Flora in the pantry, rummaging, Nickel's word, for frosting. Nickel scooped out old ashes from the fireplace and built a new fire for the day. I lifted the door lever and went outside to stand in the quiet. Then I leaped through the deep snow, through the woods, around the pond, and out to the road where Flora and Nickel's car had been. I stood looking down the road. The quiet was almost as loud as the noise of the wind. The snow was high. No one had plowed. It was the longest stretch of white I'd ever seen, up and down the long road. I listened, but there were no faraway sounds of cars or plow trucks. Silence. I turned and went back around the pond, heavy with snow. I passed trees with branches all white. Then home. I shook the snow off my body, then lifted the lever and walked inside. Flora and Nickel looked at me. "We can have a party. There's time," I said. Ellie comes to take Sylvan back to the doctor. She brings me snacks. Sylvan looks tired and weak, though he has been taking his medicine. "I plan to talk to the doctor with you today," says Ellie. "Don't be a nag," says Sylvan. "I have to be a nag. You have Teddy to take care for." Sylvan looks at her as he opens the front door. He looks at me then. Yes, I do, he says softly. When they come home again, I can tell they have been arguing. You should go to the hospital if the doctor says so, says Ellie. Not yet. You get sick in the hospital, says Sylvan. Ellie lifts her shoulders. All right then, I'm leaving you with my cell phone. You can call my landline if you need me, and that's it. No one speaks. Ellie and Sylvan stare at each other as if at war. Finally, Sylvan gives in. All right, he says, leave the phone. And that is when I know Sylvan will not live long. Ellie gives me a kiss on the head. As she opens the door, Sylvan calls to her. Thank you, Ellie. I see a flash of tears in her eyes. Sylvan puts his hand on my head the way he does when we walk in the woods. Then he goes to his computer with his tweed jacket still on. He writes something and prints it out. Then he goes to the couch where he sleeps all night long. I don't sleep on my red rug, even though a low fire burns there. I sleep next to where Sylvan sleeps, waking to watch and listen to him. At dawn, he wakes. He takes Ellie's cell phone out of his pocket. He dials a number. Ellie, please come, he says. He looks at me. Ellie will take care of you, but I hope you find a jewel or two, Teddy. A jewel or two? What does he mean? I lean against him. A jewel or two, he repeats. Trust me. And he closes his eyes, his hand still on my neck. By the time Ellie gets there, he is still. Silence. Much later, Ellie finds Sylvan's printed note on the desk next to his computer. Ellie reads it to me. Dear Teddy and Ellie, you both made my life joyful. I have left the cabinet to Teddy with both your names there and on my bank account. Ellie, I know you will make sure Teddy is fine, and as you offered, you will be Teddy's guardian to help him find a life with someone who hears his wise words. I love you both. Sylvan. Ellie puts her arms around me. We will both be fine, she says, her voice quiet and strong. The party food was chocolate frosted cookies, hard as stone but tasty. Flora dribbled frosting on my kibbles. I didn't tell her chocolate was not good for dogs. I lifted the door lever and went outside. Nickel had shoveled every day, so that I walked out on a snow path to look at all the white. Suddenly I saw a faraway figure, dressed in red, skiing through the woods. The figure came closer and closer, coming out of the woods into the clearing towards the house. I knew who it was. Teddy, called Ellie. I couldn't believe how happy I was to see her. I wagged my tail and jumped on her as she stopped. She laughed and patted me as she took off her skis, falling down in the snow to hug me. Teddy, she said out of breath, I was worried about you in the storm. Did you ski all the way from home? Yes, it was the only way to get to you. My car is buried and the snow and ice on the roads aren't cleared. I know. She looked at the chimney of the cabin. There's smoke from a fire. I got up and we walked to the cabin door. I didn't build it, I said to Ellie. You'd better come in. Ellie leaned her skis against the house. We opened the door. Inside the warm cabin, Nickel and Flora turned from the fireplace. Nickel's eyes widened when he saw another human with me. This is Ellie, I said happily. This is Ellie. Nickel and Flora loved Ellie right away. Ellie loved the hard cookies with chocolate frosting. She ate 3 of them, sitting in front of the fire with her hand on my neck. I heard on my radio that you 2 were saved by a family with 6 children. And Ellie, you left a note on the front seat of your mother's car. We looked at Flora. Flora actually blushed. I forgot that part of the note, she said. I added a bit. Ellie laughed. It worked. Your parents were not worried about you. Probably tomorrow or the next day after, the roads will begin to be cleared. Maybe all the power will be back on. She paused. I'm glad that you came here, she said to Nickel and Flora. We're glad Teddy saved us, said Nickel. I learned how to save you, I said. From Sylvan, said Flora, nodding. Teddy told us about Sylvan. All of a sudden, Ellie sat up straight, a strange look on her face. I just realized something was amazing and wonderful. What? said Nickel. Ellie took a deep breath. You and Flora hear Teddy's wise words, she said. She took my face in her hands. They do, she whispered. What Sylvan wished for. They do. You do, I said. A bit like the past and the present coming together. Don't you think? Ellie grinned. I do think, she said, nodding. Ellie made her way home again after lunch, carrying the telephone number of Nickel and Flora's parents. Their names are Ruby and Jake, said Nickel. It's probably best to tell them you were here when Teddy found us. They might not understand us being saved by an Irish wolfhound. I'll tell them you're fine and give them directions to this house, said Ellie. And I am here. They could surprise you, of course. They might be so happy to see you both that they won't care who found you. I don't remember them ever surprising me, said Flora. Except when they try to dance. Don't forget, said Nickel. Flora nodded. They are not very good at dancing, she said thoughtfully. Outside, Ellie put on her skis again. She kissed all of us and went off, a red spot against the white. Flora and Nickel laughed. I knew they would. I knew they believed in me. And we slept for the last time together, in a heap, in front of the fireplace, in the quiet cabin. It happened before we thought it would. The knock at the door, Nickel opening the door. A man I knew must be his father, sweeping Nickel up in his arms. Nickel crying. I'd never seen Nickel cry until now. Only the tears streaked on his face the day I found him in the storm. Flora stood by the fireplace, watching. I went to stand next to her, and she put her hand on my neck the way I love. Nickel's father looked over at Flora then. He came into the house, closing the door behind him. Thank you for your note, Flora, he said, coming over to take her hand. I don't think he even noticed me beside her. He picked her up and hugged her. She put her arms around his neck. I liked the smell of them. Ellie told me that she had been here with you, her father said. Flora leaned back and her father put her down. This is Teddy, she said. He found us. He saved us and brought us here, not the family with 6 children. I made them up so you wouldn't worry. Her father stared at me for a moment. Hello, Teddy. I'm Jake, he said. Hello, Jake, I said. Jake shook his head a bit, looking confused. He doesn't hear your words, whispered Flora very softly. I know, I'm used to answering questions whether people hear me or not. But he hears something. Jake looked over my head and the bookshelf. Wait, he said, who lives here? Was this Sylvan's house? I see pictures on the wall. I see his books on the shelf. We were surprised. Yes, said Nickel. Sylvan lived here with Teddy. He rescued Teddy the way Teddy rescued us. Jake sat down. You're the Teddy of his poem. He, the poet's dog, he said softly. Yes, I said. Jake bent his head as if he was listening to something far away. Flora smiled a little. He was my teacher, said Jake, and he sent me the poem. Jake grinned. Sylvan told me once that I could be a poet if I wasn't so lazy. Nickel laughed. Flora went over to her father. I'm not going home without Teddy, she said. There was a big silence in the cabin. I felt the hair on my neck stand up a bit. Finally, Jake shrugged his shoulders. You're right, Flora Jewel. If Teddy saved you, he should come home with us. He doesn't have Sylvan now, he added. Jewel? Flora noticed my startled look. It's my middle name, he whispered. Silly? My mother is Ruby. Not silly. Not silly at all. Will you come home with us, Teddy? Asked Flora. I thought of leaving my cabin. How could I do that? Flora saw my face. Flora always seemed to know what I was thinking. Ellie can bring you back here for visits whenever you want. Yes, he will come home, Nickel said. Jake stroked my head. Yes, he will come home with us, he said. Flora Jewel? We put out the fire and closed the cabin door. We walked uphill where Jake's big car was parked. I don't remember ever being in a car before. Surely Sylvan brought me home from the shelter in someone's car. But that was when I didn't have words. Nickel leaned over close to me in the back seat. I think he almost hears you speak, he whispered. He isn't a poet, but he wouldn't mind being one. He teaches literature. You can hear me. That's what really matters, I said. And you never told me he teaches literature. He didn't ask me, Nickel said. Jake called Ruby on his cell phone on our ride home. Ruby? I have Flora and Nickel. We're on our way home. They were rescued by a wonderful dog. Teddy took them to his home and cared for them. Ruby, Teddy is coming home with us too. There was a silence as Jake listened. He looked at us in the rearview mirror and smiled. Ruby says, great. And we rode home on snowy roads past snow-covered meadows and ponds and trees. The whole way there, we were the only car in the whole world. When we got to the big white house on the hill and got out of the car, the front door opened, and Ruby ran into the cold without her coat. Flora and Nickel ran up the hill to hug her, and then she saw me. She burst into tears, reminding me of Flora. An Irish wolfhound? You didn't tell me he was an Irish wolfhound. I grew up with one all of my childhood. She put her hand on my neck and knelt down with her face next to mine, like Flora did when I first took her to the cabin in the snowstorm. Jewel was the best dog in the world, and you look just like her. Jewel. Ruby put her hand on my neck. Welcome home, Teddy, she said. Find a jewel or two, Sylvan had said. Trust me. And as we walked up the hill, I felt Sylvan was walking alongside me. Flora was right. Sylvan had never left at all.